What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we will be breaking down our must-start running backs for Week 16 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, usually with my must-start videos, you guys know that I'm not going to include top-tier players like Christian McCaffrey or Austin Eckler, who are obvious must-starts, but we really just need to mention Derrick Henry as the must-start running back for the week. At least 20 or more fantasy points in Henry's last two starts. Your RB4 overall so far on the season. And here in the second round of the fantasy playoffs, he gets the Houston Texans, the team that is allowing the most points to the running back position so far on the season. Derrick Henry, a must-start by the purest meaning of the definition. He is absolutely in your lineup. Our must-start running back of the week. Derrick Henry might have his best game of the season as we approach Week 16. All right, I got another stud for you. SAQUON Barkley coming in as your RB5 so far on the season. 23 fantasy points against the Washington Commanders in Week 15. 18 touches on the ground, 87 rushing yards, a touchdown, and 5 receptions for 33 receiving yards. I really encouraged you guys after the poor performance in Week 14 for Barkley to keep him in your lineups going into Week 15, and that really paid off. He gets the Minnesota Vikings here in Week 16, a unit that is allowing the 12th most fantasy points to the running back position, but also a defensive unit that is just not playing good as of late. The Vikings will be fighting for a potential #1 seed if the Eagles lose enough games in the NFC. And on the other hand, the Giants are fighting to keep their wild card playoff spot alive. I think this is going to be a game with a lot of offensive points. I think that SAQUON Barkley is another really solid start. Just trying to boost your guys' overall confidence. Once again, if you own Barkley, he is not a player that we bench just due to the upside that he brings on a weekly basis. Barkley, a must-start running back going into Week 16. All right, last week we had ISIAH, PACHECO, and JERICK McKinnon as absolute must-starts going up against the Houston Texans, a unit we just talked about a couple moments ago. This week they get the Seattle Seahawks, a unit allowing the second most fantasy points to the running back position so far on the season. Let's talk about Pacheco's performance last week. He did have 86 yards on the ground, 5.7 yards per carry. I mean, he had a good day on the ground, but he did fumble early, and that kind of led him to struggle throughout the game. He added a reception for 11 receiving yards and total just 8.7 fantasy points. Still a really disappointing day. A lot of fantasy managers had high expectations for Pacheco, who had given you double-digit fantasy points in his last 4 games, and then got the unit that's allowing the most fantasy points to the position in Week 15. 8.7 fantasy points is ultimately a letdown, but I think we keep him in our starting lineups moving into Week 16 against a really bad Seahawks run defense in an important game for both the Chiefs and the Seahawks. On the other hand, let's talk about JERICK McKinnon, who may literally become the waiver wire edition of the 2022 fantasy football season, probably right next to a guy like Christian Watson with what he's brought to the table here at the end of the season. Most importantly, games getting you into the playoffs and the start of the playoffs. 34.2 fantasy points against the Texans in Week 15, 52 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 8 receptions for 70 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. A huge day for JERICK McKinnon. I kind of worried about McKinnon going into the week. I thought this might turn into kind of a ground and pound day for the Chiefs as they held a lead early in this game, and Pacheco took a lot of the carries. I just didn't know if McKinnon would necessarily need to see the passing volume that we saw in the previous week against the Denver Broncos, a game where the Chiefs were playing from behind. But once again, for the second week in a row, Week 14 against the Cowboys and Week 15 against the Chiefs, the Houston Texans surprised us and made this game competitive. McKinnon was involved in this game all the way through till overtime and ultimately won this game for the Chiefs. He is a player who I cannot stress needs to be in our starting lineups as we move into week 16. Like I said, a little bit worried last week about the competitive game script. We got a competitive game script, and even regardless against the Texans, I still couldn't say to sit him. Here against the Seahawks, there's no doubt in my mind we're starting McKinnon here in week 16. All right, next up I've got ALVIN KAMARA, who I think is a solid flex going into the week. Last week I thought the same. He got the Atlanta Falcons, 12.4 fantasy points, not a bad day. I really, in my mind, I thought he was going to bounce back. He had a really tough stretch between weeks 9 and 13. The Ravens, the Steelers, the Rams, the Niners, and the Bucks, all teams that have played well against the run so far on the season, before having the bye week in week 14, then getting the Falcons this previous week in week 15. 91 yards on the ground and 2 receptions for 13 receiving yards. Really, if KAMARA found the end zone, which I kind of expected him to do so, he would have had a much better fantasy day, but ultimately still got you double-digit fantasy points. And he gets the Browns this week, a unit that has played very, very poorly against opposing running backs throughout the entire season. So I think that KAMARA is a solid flex option, another lock for double-digit fantasy points moving into week 16 of the season. All right, this one might surprise you a little bit, but I've got Najee Harris. It's just a really solid flex option going into the week, or if you're struggling at the running back position, maybe you own Najee Harris and you lost Jonathan Taylor this past week. Najee Harris is a really good start against the Las Vegas Raiders, a team that has been in the bottom 5 against the running back position for quite a few weeks and just got absolutely torched by Ramondre Stevenson on the ground last week. And Najee Harris has had double-digit fantasy points in his last 5 performances. He's had double-digit fantasy points in every game except for week 10 since week 6, and he barely missed the mark in week 10 at 9.9 fantasy points. So does Harris bring a ton of upside? No, but he is consistent and he does hit that double-digit mark on a very frequent basis. Scored 5 touchdowns in the last 5 weeks, and he gets a great matchup here. I really would not be worried about Najee Harris. I know ultimately on the season he's been disappointing, but right now he's sitting as your RB15 overall. The numbers have been good enough as of late, and the matchup is good enough that I think Harris can definitely be considered as a flex and is a really good fill-in if you're hurting at the running back position moving in to week 16. All right, next up on the list, I've got J.K. Dobbins, one of our must-start running backs from last week going up against the Cleveland Browns. He had 13.8 fantasy points. He looked really good on the ground, 9.62 yards per carry, 125 rushing yards off of 13 touches, and he added 1 reception. All he was missing was a touchdown for a really stellar fantasy performance. 120 or more rushing yards in his last 2 games, and he gets the Atlanta Falcons, a team that is allowing the 13th most fantasy points to the running back position so far on the year here in week 16. I think it's just another solid start. Don't get me wrong, Gus Edwards is still a little bit involved in this backfield, 7 touches last week, but it's J.K. Dobbins backfield at the end of the day. Another solid matchup here for J.K. Dobbins at the end of the day, and a game script that should stay competitive as the Falcons technically have a chance to make it into the playoffs, and the Ravens want to hold on to their playoff spots. I think that Dobbins will lead this Ravens offense at the end of the day because we don't know who's going to be playing at quarterback quite yet. There's really no other direction for this Ravens offense to go, and Dobbins has looked really, really good since his second return from injury so far on the season. Dobbins a really solid start moving into the week. All right, Jeff Wilson is dealing with a hip injury. He missed week 15's loss against the Buffalo Bills. He's considered day-to-day at the moment for the Miami Dolphins, and ultimately they turn to RAHEEM MOSTERT, who had 16.6 fantasy points in week 15, 136 yards on the ground, and added a reception for 20 receiving yards. A really good overall day for Mostert, who will get the Green Bay Packers, a team that has been struggling against the run as of late. I think Mostert is just a solid start in a competitive game. It's a game that the Green Bay Packers absolutely need to win to keep their playoff hopes alive. And on the other hand, the Dolphins, who have been struggling as of late, need to win this game as well to stay in the playoffs and keep the best possible record. So this should be another competitive game script, which is something we really are trying to pay attention to at this point in the fantasy season. On top of that, it's a great matchup for Mostert. Even if Jeff Wilson is out there, I still like Mostert as the lead back, as Wilson has been struggling as of late and has been banged up. So I think Mostert is a really solid flex, a good enough RB2 if you're struggling at the position. Moving into week 16. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.